Okay, so when you think about tourism in Africa, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's probably that classic safari image, right? Big open savannas, incredible wildlife, and these landscapes that feel like some kind of untouched paradise. But that picture, the one you see in the travel brochure, that's really just the cover of a much, much deeper and more complicated story. So let's peel back those layers and get into it. This quote, it just nails the way the continent has been portrayed, especially through a Western lens. On one side, you have Eden, this idea of a mystical, pure, unexplored paradise. And on the other, Armageddon, a place full of danger, harsh climates, and encounters with people who were framed as somehow savage. But here's the thing. This huge contrast wasn't just discovered. It was carefully, deliberately constructed. And to really get a handle on tourism in Africa today, we have to go back and see how that frame was built in the first place. So yeah, that image of a wild Africa, it wasn't a reflection of what was actually there. It was a creation, a product of the colonial era. It was a story told with a very specific goal, to define the continent and its people in a way that, well, justified colonial expansion and sold a certain fantasy to a European audience. This whole process really gets going in the 19th century. You have European explorers, who were basically the advanced team for colonialism, showing up and getting credit for discovering landmarks like Lake Tanganyika. I mean, they conveniently forgot about the people who had lived there for centuries. This was quickly followed by what one scholar perfectly calls the otherness industry. Think a flood of postcards, travel books, and world fairs, all designed to make African people seem exotic and strange, which of course reinforced the idea of European superiority. It created this huge us versus them mentality that stuck around for a long, long time. A really key part of this industry was something called spectatorial lust. Now, this wasn't just about looking, it was about consuming people as a spectacle, as entertainment. Africans were literally put on display to perform their culture or just exist for the curiosity and pleasure of Europeans. The tragic story of Sarja Bartman, who was exhibited in Europe because of her body, is just a painful and powerful example of how a human being was turned into an object of fascination. And that leads directly to this incredibly common image, the colonial nude. It was driven entirely by a European male fantasy. Postcards sent home from places like the French and Belgian colonies were just filled with these images of African women, always shown as bare-breasted and promiscuous. This wasn't real, it was a complete fabrication designed to be the exact opposite of the proper Victorian woman back in Europe, and it played a massive role in creating harmful stereotypes about African women that we still see today. So you have this entire narrative, this whole visual library being built and spread by Europeans. But to build up one story, you have to tear another one down, or in this case, just ignore it completely. And what got ignored was the fact that Africans had been traveling and exploring their own continent for thousands of years, long before any colonial camera showed up. This is really the crucial question, isn't it? Colonialism wasn't just physical violence. It was also what one writer called a violence of memory. The goal was to erase the histories that already existed and replace them with a new one, a version where Africa was basically an empty stage, just waiting to be discovered. This chart just makes the difference so clear. European travel? It was written down in diaries and called a discovery. African travel, on the other hand, was just a normal part of life. It was for trade, for family obligations, and its history was passed down through incredible oral traditions. For example, the Maasai knew their land inside and out long before colonizers arrived. But because their history wasn't written down in a book, it was just dismissed as not real. So this is the main point to take away here. Just because a history isn't written down doesn't mean it doesn't exist, period. Oral traditions are a completely valid record of history. The colonial narrative is just one story, and believe me, it is far from the only truth. African societies were complex and connected way before any Europeans showed up. All right, so how does all this history connect to tourism right now? Well, those old ideas, the primitive warrior, the exotic native, they never really went away. They just got a rebrand. They've been repackaged and are now sold to modern tourists as authentic cultural experiences. To really see how this works, there's a fantastic case study by an anthropologist named Edward Bruner. He looked at 3 different tourist performances featuring Maasai warriors in Kenya. At a place called Myers Ranch, tourists got the primitive warrior, a totally staged show designed to look ancient and untouched, a pure colonial fantasy. Then at Bomas of Kenya, which is run by the government, they saw the national citizen, where Maasai culture is presented as just one piece of a modern unified Kenya. And finally, at a luxury safari camp called Kichwa Tembo, tourists got the global entertainer. A wild mix where Maasai dancing happens right alongside champagne and sing-alongs to global songs. See, each place creates a totally different version of authentic for a different crowd. Now, looking at that, it's pretty easy to just assume that these local communities are passive victims, right? Just dressing up and performing for a paycheck. But that's where the story takes another turn. Are they just being exploited, or is there something else going on here? The reality is so much more interesting. These communities are not just passive performers. They're active agents. They negotiate, they resist, they even reshape the whole tourist experience to serve their own needs. In a very real way, they are reclaiming the gaze. And you can see this agency in some really powerful ways. For instance, some Zulu warrior performers will deliberately play up the most extreme savage stereotypes, like gobbling raw meat, specifically to make tourists uncomfortable. It's a subtle act of resistance that basically turns the camera back on the audience, making them question what they expected to see. Then you've got the Walla Islanders in the Pacific. They've taken ownership of their own history and are now packaging and selling it to visitors on their own terms. It's not just about money, it's about controlling their own story. And in South Africa, tour operators are turning townships from places of oppression into incredible sites for education and real human connection. This quote from someone living in a South African township, it's just incredibly powerful. For people who have been historically ignored, made invisible, the simple act of a tourist just walking down their street can be deeply, profoundly affirming. It breaks that history of being unseen. It's not just about money. It's about being acknowledged as a person who exists in the world. This idea of connection is captured so beautifully in the philosophy of Ubuntu. You might have heard it summarized as, I am because we are. It's this core belief in a universal bond that connects every single one of us. And in the world of tourism, it suggests that these encounters, even if they start out on unequal footing, can actually become moments of shared humanity, of learning from each other, and maybe even healing some of what one tour guide called the wounds of the past. So as we pull all this together, it's pretty clear that tourism in Africa isn't some simple story with heroes and villains. It's a deeply complicated, ongoing negotiation between a heavy colonial past and a really fast-moving, globalized present. What we're really watching is a collision of worlds. It's a space where everything is bumping up against everything else. You've got tourists chasing old colonial fantasies, governments trying to build a single national identity, the huge influence of pop culture, and local communities just trying to survive and represent themselves. So yes, it can be a site of exploitation, but it can also be a powerful tool for empowerment. There are no easy answers. Just think about the rise of dark tourism. Places of unimaginable suffering, like Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned, are now major tourist destinations. And that brings up some really tough moral questions. On one hand, you're commodifying pain. But on the other, these visits can be incredibly powerful educational tools that help people understand history and feel empathy, creating these bright connections out of some very dark pasts. And that leaves us with one last, really crucial question to think about. When we travel, when we buy an experience, whose story are we actually consuming? Are we just buying a pre-packaged narrative that's been made for us? Or are we participating in a real, genuine exchange? The answer is almost never simple, but just asking the question, that's the first and most important step to being a more aware, more connected traveler.